just when you thought we had these new forms, we were getting under control, they went and changed them on us again. So let's talk about it. The information and opinions expressed in this video are my own and are intended for educational purposes only. They do not constitute legal, financial, or real estate advice. Real estate transactions are complex and every situation is unique. Before making any decisions or taking any action based on the content of this video, please consult with your broker or a qualified professional. I am not responsible for any decisions made based on the information provided here. Always follow your broker's guidance and adhere to the local laws and regulations. Hey everybody, it's your favorite tech training broker, Bren Brewer. And yes, just as we were getting used to the June changes to the contracts, as of August 15th, some changes went out. And today I am recording this video on August 23rd, and you have new contracts that went into effect for Texas real estate. So let's get right into it. We're going to go over the residential real estate listing agreement first, the exclusive right to sell. There were some changes. I'm going to show you the red line versions first because then you'll be able to see the actual changes. So let me go to that. You can see here, page 1, we only have August, the date change here to show that that's the date it went into effect. And then on page 2, at the broker compensation 5, paragraph 5, we have a lot of changes. So let's go through those really quickly. So it's showing here that 5A, they have a red line. So the seller authorizes broker to compensate the other broker as indicated below. It's going to be removed and it says just complete both 1 and 2. So when you're doing 5A, you complete 1 and 2. Then it says here, 5A1, you either have a percentage or a flat fee they are adding. So they're making that a little bit more clear to know what you're supposed to put in that blank. And then underneath, they're adding a whole paragraph that says, if broker does not pay the other broker that procures a buyer as specified in paragraph 5A2, broker's fee in this paragraph 5A1 will be reduced by any amount not paid to other broker. So this is going to come into play when there's a broker on both sides, the listing side and the buy side. And let's say the buyer rep agreement only, let's say they negotiated 2% only in their buyer rep agreement, the buyer broker, right? But the seller was offering 2.5%. So he is offering 2.5%. The total commission on listing side was 5%. So you would get 2.5%. 2% would go to the buyer's broker, and then that 0.5% goes back to the seller. It's not going back to the listing broker or the buyer broker. Next change, 5A2, they're striking out from the amount stated in 5A1 above, broker will pay the other broker the following fees if the other broker procures a buyer that purchases property. And they are adding, if the other broker procures a buyer that purchases a property, seller authorizes broker to pay, and broker will pay the other broker the following fees from amounts specified in 5A1. So basically 5A1, you're negotiating the whole side. So you would put the total percentage 5A1A, and then 5A2, you're going to put the split between listing broker and buying broker. If you negotiated 5%, you would put it 5A1A, 5%, and then 5A2, you're going to put 2.5%. And then each brokerage would get 2.5% based on that scenario. Now, they've also added line item 3 where it says seller authorizes broker to publicly disclose compensation for the other broker as specified in 5A2. So if the seller is authorizing cooperating compensation to be paid, then they are automatically allowing you to publicly disclose the compensation. Let me read that again. Seller authorizes broker to publicly disclose compensation for the other broker as specified in 5A2. So that means They are authorizing you by signing this document to advertise the compensation. You just cannot advertise it on the MLS system anymore. Now, number 4 says broker will retain amounts specified in 5A1 as broker's fee if there is no other broker that procures the buyer, including but not limited to transactions where the broker represents both seller and buyer, intermediary, or if the buyer is unrepresented. Amounts specified in 5A2 will be applied towards any fees a buyer has agreed to pay broker as specified in a separate written agreement. Number 4 applies in the scenarios where there's no other broker involved except for the listing brokerage, if there's an intermediary situation, or if the buyer is unrepresented. So if a buyer comes, makes an offer on your listing and they have no agent and they don't want an agent, that's an unrepresented buyer and they can do that as well. Anyways, as amounts that's specified in 5A2 will be applied towards any fees a buyer has agreed to pay a broker as specified in a separate written agreement. So if they had an agreement towards their brokerage, then those fees would apply to them. But if they don't, if they're unrepresented or intermediary, then the listing brokerage is going to retain what is in 5A1. Next change in B, and remember we're only using B if the seller does not agree to compensate the buying brokerage, okay? So 5B1A states when earned and payable, seller will pay broker, and you're going to insert a percentage of the sales price or a flat fee. So they're just making the language on that line item more clear. Now the next page, page 3, it says the note after commissions. They're redlining all of that paragraph right there and removing it. And now it's going to say seller does or does not authorize broker to disclose to other brokers and prospective buyers that seller will consider contributing an amount towards buyer expenses, such as buyer broker fees and other expenses payable by a buyer under a sales contract. Seller is not obligated to pay any specific amount and has sole discretion to determine the amount the seller will pay towards buyer expenses during negotiations with a buyer. It says use TXR 1412 to authorize broker to disclose and advertise additional information, such as a specific amount of seller concessions. This only pertains to concessions. This does not pertain to compensation. The seller does or does not authorize the broker to disclose any concessions. Okay, so that's going to be credits to closing, things of that nature. Has nothing here to do with compensation. They've already agreed to disclose the compensation on 5A3. Okay, there's no need to disclose compensation for 5B because they're not offering any. So they're not giving you authorization to disclose that because there isn't any. So here, if they want to give concessions, that's where you would do that here. Does or does not. All right, let's go down to see if there's any other changes. And these contracts, these forms, are going into effect as of August 23rd, 2024. Okay, on paragraph 11D, they are redlining an item that said, in accordance with applicable MLS rules as outlined in paragraph 6, broker may disseminate information about the property to other brokers and to prospective buyers, including offers of compensation to buyer representatives. They're striking that out. So now it's going to say disseminate information about the property to other brokers and to prospective buyers, including applicable disclosures or notices that seller is required to make under law or a contract. So they're removing that offers of compensation to buyer reps. They're also removing the entirety of paragraph F because they moved it up to the compensation section. So that whole paragraph is being removed because it's up here on the authorization to disclose. Let's see what else they've changed. Looks like just the date on everything else. So that's actually not too bad. It looks like most of it is just to clarify the wording that was in there. There may have been some confusion. So from June to August, we've got a little bit of new changes, but actually it's not bad for the listing agreement. So let's move on. Here we have the compensation agreement between brokers, which the buyer agents are going to be sending this over either before or with their offer if your seller has authorized cooperating compensation. So it says here the parties, that kind of thing. They have changed this, just a couple of things. They've added a line item on number 5 A, they've added a third line item and then they changed the language to say a flat fee of. So not many changes to this compensation agreement, should be pretty much business as usual on what we've already covered. So let's talk about the addendum regarding broker fees. There's quite a few changes on this. So let's talk about it. It says listing broker fee. So they've added it to be plural. It says seller shall pay listing broker the fees specified in a separate written representation agreement between seller and listing broker. Now it says other brokers' fees. Other brokers' fees will be paid as specified below, and buyer shall pay any remaining amount due to the other broker specified in a separate written agreement. So instead of under a separate written agreement, it's specified in a separate written agreement. I think that's a good word change. It adds a little more clarification. And then D1, they've added specified amount is for informational purposes only and does not change compensation specified in separate written agreements. So D1 is going to be from your 5A1 in the listing agreement. D1 is going to be from 5A1. We're just clarifying it, putting it in the contract with an addendum so that all parties know what each compensation is. So it's more transparent that everybody from all sides, all parties know what compensation is being paid to all brokers. Number two, they're adding language here at the end of this line that says specified amount is for informational purposes only and does not change compensation specified in separate written agreements. So this is going to come from the 2401. So maybe the seller wasn't offering compensation as cooperating compensation, but they're offering it just from as a credit from themselves. So that's going to be that 2401. Let me find that. Okay, so the compensation agreement between broker and owner is the 2401. So if the seller is not offering any cooperating compensation, you can definitely come in with this compensation agreement between broker and owner and ask for that compensation to be done that way. Instead of cooperating and the listing brokerage pays the buyer brokerage, it'll be a line item on the closing statement directly from the seller to the buyer broker. So read through this. We went over it last week. There's not any changes on this for August 23rd. You can see it still says June 24th. I'm pulling this straight from the Texas Realtors website. So that was Form 2401. So if the seller is paying the buyer brokerage directly at closing on the closing statement, then that's going to be number two, and you're going to use 2401. If the seller authorized cooperating compensation, then the seller is only paying the listing broker and the listing brokerage is paying the buyer's brokerage. That's a different form. It's 2402, and that is only number one checked. So let's see, 2402. And that's going to be this compensation agreement between brokers. You can see I have the red line version. They've added language here, a flat fee of, to be less conspicuous. It was needed, and that's the only change that's on this form. All right, moving on. D2B. This is a percent or a flat fee of the sales price towards other brokers' fees. You will only use this option if there is no separate written compensation agreement between the seller and the other broker. This is going to create a new obligation for the seller. So basically, you could use this as a part of the offer, a negotiation tool there. You can put in there your fee and put it as part of the offer package. So if there's no compensation agreement between brokers and no compensation agreement between seller and other broker, then you would use D2B. Now it looks like they're adding a whole paragraph in here on E. It says intermediary broker fees. In addition to any fees, seller has agreed to pay listing broker in a separate written representation agreement. Seller shall also pay listing broker blank flat fee or blank percent of sales price. Amounts specified in this paragraph shall be applied towards any fees buyer has agreed to pay listing broker in a separate written representation agreement. Buyer shall pay any remaining amount due to listing broker specified in a separate written representation agreement. You will use this option only if the listing broker represents the seller and the buyer as an intermediary, and this is going to create a new obligation of the seller. Okay. They're removing the red items here. It says amounts in one and two are for informational purpose only and do not change compensation listed in a separate written compensation agreement. Any amount listed in 2B creates a new obligation for the seller. So they removed that and added it to each line item, which I think is a lot more clear. It's actually a lot better. Then they changed the next paragraph to F because they added a new paragraph, and then it says the seller and buyer authorize escrow agent to pay listing and other broker at closing in accordance with this addendum or other separate written agreements. And then they've added the date. So those changes are fairly straightforward and actually make it a lot more clear. One of the other forms that changed is the general information and notice to buyers and sellers. You may not need this, but I include this on all of my transactions, all my sellers, all my buyers get this document. It's actually a required document at my office, but I was giving this to them before it was ever required by my office. So they have changed the compensation paragraph on page 1. They've added a couple of lines in here that says broker compensation or the sharing of compensation between brokers is not set by law nor fixed, controlled, recommended, or suggested by the Association of Realtors, MLS, or any listing service. Broker compensation is fully negotiable and brokers independently determine their fees. And then they removed broker compensation is not set by law and is fully negotiable. So they added some words and removed. Very straightforward here. And it doesn't look like anything else has changed. So general information and notice to buyers and sellers. So they did do a couple of changes on the buyer representation agreement on the long form. The long form is your full service form, so make sure that you know what changes these are. So let's go through it. Added language to say percent or flat fee, makes that a little bit more clear. Glad they did that. And then it looks like here on 7E, number 2 and 3 here, they've made changes. So now this is paragraph 2 and this is paragraph 3. It says additional compensation is this paragraph. It says other compensation, and it says only insert amounts or rates of compensation that are objectively ascertainable and the specific amount or rate is known at the time of execution. Do not insert bonuses, a range of compensation, or terms such as TBD. So they're trying to make it very clear that you cannot put an open-ended statement in here about other compensation. Okay? So if you do come across a bonus on a new construction or a BTSA from the seller on a listing, then you will have to do an amendment to this buyer rep agreement. That way it is very clear that your buyers are aware of what compensation you are getting. And I've even heard of builders asking for the buyer rep agreement. So just be aware. And then it also says notice regarding bonuses and other compensation. They've removed other compensation and they've removed other compensation such as, and then looks like they've just removed the words compensation and other compensation. So it should read like this. Notice regarding bonuses. In addition to broker's fees specified under paragraph 7A, seller, landlord, or their agent may offer to pay broker a bonus if client purchases or leases certain properties. Broker will disclose the specific amount of any bonus offered to broker. Broker may not receive any bonus unless authorized by client in writing. Client authorization may be made by amending this agreement. So you would use the 1505 amendment to the buyer representation agreement. So that's the changes there. It's making everything a lot more clear. I like these changes. So let's go on to the amendment to the buyer representation agreement. You can see here the changes. They've added a line, and then everything in D is just adding more clarifying language. It says a percent or a flat fee if client purchases the following property. You'll put the property address. Same thing on leases, added the flat fee if client purchased the following property. And then again, bonuses, they removed the same words that they removed from the rep agreement. And then it will read like this. In addition to a broker's fee listed in paragraph 7A, broker will be paid a bonus from seller, landlord, or their agent in the amount equal to, and then you'll put the amount there, if client purchases or leases the following property. And you'll put the property address. So very clarifying. I think it was needed. I'm glad they made these changes and I'm glad they got them out so quickly. They released the red line documents on August 15th, August 23rd. We've got all these changes. So I'm liking it. And that's it for the documents that I went over last week that had changes. So if you have any questions, make sure and drop them in the comments below and I'll see you next week.